Joining me on the guest line in just a few moments, a gentleman who penned some extraordinary opinion words at CNN.com. Let me read this to you, just a little bit of this, in a piece entitled, "Let's Have the Conversation About Race." Americans are told we need to have a national conversation in which we talk about race. And yet when we have horrific crimes with white victims where the alleged perpetrators are African American or Latino, we're told we cannot talk about race. This isn't true when the roles are reversed. If the victims are African American or Latino and the alleged perpetrator is white, we talk about race until our throats go dry. Are you confused? Join the club. And the man who wrote that is a member of the Washington Post Writers Group. That was published, as I said, at CNN.com. I just tweeted that, and we've retweeted that from our WMAL News Twitter account. Ruben Navarrette joins me on the guest line from his offices in San Diego. Ruben, welcome back to the district, and welcome to WMAL. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you again.
Always a pleasure to hook up with you. A lot of us are confused about this seeming double standard in the dominant media and in our dominant culture. What do you make of it?
Well, part of what I make of it is this tendency, as I say in my piece, for journalists to play nanny. We have this horrible trend of nanny journalism where instead of who, what, where, why, we go off and try to tell people how to be better people. And there are times where I'm writing a story, a column, where I feel sometimes the editor or the people above the editor are trying to ensure a certain outcome. In this case, we have to be careful, we're told, when we throw around the race of a perpetrator or a victim, because we don't want to create more racial strife than already exists. And I think that's exactly the wrong thing you should do when you sit down to your computer.
I would certainly agree as a not only a commentator and opinionist, so to speak, myself, but as a journalist as well. I agree with that. That said, you mentioned in your editorial column, Ruben, you make great reference to the horrific case of Christopher Lane, a 22-year-old college baseball player from Melbourne, Australia, who is playing college ball in Oklahoma and senselessly murdered while out jogging in a neighborhood. And it's not just the media that treats these things differently. It seems to me that people in very high office treat these things differently according to the skin color of victims and alleged perpetrators. Make of that what you will. Tell us what your thoughts are. The fact that we've heard nothing about this incident in Oklahoma, say from the White House, and I'm not aware anybody from Congress has even commented on it.
Yeah, I said in my piece, when are we going to, people are talking about comparing this to the Trayvon Martin shooting, saying, when do we get to that moment when the president says, well, if I had a friend from Australia who played baseball, he might look like Chris Lane. That's never happened. It won't happen. And there is this sort of dominant narrative, and you're broadcasting from Washington, D.C. This is really the center of that narrative. And the narrative is that race relations is always black and white. We've gotten to a point some time ago where Latinos, for instance, outnumber African Americans. You wouldn't know it on my trips to Washington, where everything in Washington is still in black and white. And for good or bad, those public policies come out as a discussion of black and white. And the other dominant narrative is whenever something goes wrong, we just feel more comfortable talking about a white perpetrator and an African American victim than the other way around. And it's very difficult in both those cases to combat that dominant narrative. People get thinking in my business, they get used to thinking a certain way. It's very hard to get them to think otherwise.
Understood. Ruben Navarrette, he's with the Washington Post Writers Group. He's on the guest line here on Mornings on the Mall. It's WMAL. Ruben, I think I understand your history accurately. I think you and I are both native Californians, and I grew up in a culture and environment in Southern California and in Central California where, yes, it was very black, it was very white, but it was very Hispanic, and in many parts of my upbringing, it was very, very Asian. I mean, you're in Southern California, very culturally diverse part of the country. How does the media get beyond this black versus white dynamic and become more realistic?
That's a very good point. I grew up in Central California, in the middle of California, near Fresno, where I grew up in an elementary school, for instance, a junior high school that had attended those schools that had a variety of people. You had people who were Chinese and Japanese and Filipino and Vietnamese and Latino, as you said, and everything you could think of. And it was a great upbringing, and I really lament the fact that as I raise my kids now in Southern California, it's very difficult to replicate that. And to likewise get to a place where you have a bunch of people who are, pretty much acting harmoniously. But your point is well taken, that where we are now is it's very difficult for the media to understand the kind of upbringing you and I had. That's much more complicated. It's much more nuanced. There's different colors in the rainbow. And again, when you have the power centers, I write for two sets of editors. One's at CNN.com in New York, and the other at the Washington Post in Washington. Mm-hmm. So my life, even though I live in San Diego, my professional life is in New York and Washington. And those two centers, those two narratives I mentioned earlier, really are dominant. It's the idea that it's much easier to talk about a African-American victim and a white perpetrator. Those two strains are very strong in New York and Washington.
The fact that we saw the dominant forces in our media across the country, Ruben, insist to us that George Zimmerman was a white guy, even though he's probably looks more like you and less like me.
Right.
But the fact that we had the dominant forces say, no, he's white, is that a part of this insistence on the narrative that you're getting at?
It absolutely is. I mean, you had, in George Zimmerman's case, his brother, his family said, George has always thought of himself as Hispanic. Oh, his mom's from Peru. But rather than say that, they tacked on the adjective white, so he's a white Hispanic. It's irrelevant, antiquated term. Nobody really thinks about white Hispanic. But there's a different reason for that. It wasn't just because they wanted to feel comfortable in that dominant narrative of a white perpetrator, but also there was another reason. That is, the media is very skittish about the idea of exacerbating tensions between Latinos and African Americans. And when this story came out of Florida, the last thing they wanted was to write a story about a Latino versus African American hate crime, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And so to stay away from that narrative and to, in essence, protect the Latinos, they tacked on the adjective white, which only made it worse for everybody.
Is that to say that white people are convenient scapegoats in the dominant media?
I think that when you look at the history of this country recently, I mean, go spend a couple hours and go see The Butler. You'll see where that idea came from of white people as, scapegoats, because there's an ugly history there of race relations where, in many cases, white people were the perpetrators of violence against minorities. But, time changes. Times change. We're a different era. It takes a different time. I think it takes time for people to change their consciousness and to advance their consciousness. So we're not talking about innocence here. Oh my goodness, how did this occur? We're talking about an ingrained set of narratives going back 40, 50 years ago that I think people have not quite gotten beyond.
Ruben Navarrette, he's with the Washington Post Writers Group and has wrote an extraordinary piece, if you just joined us, published at CNN.com entitled Let's Have the Conversation About Race. Ruben, I tell you what, I'm coming up on a traffic break. I'm going to ask you to hold, and I want to spend a few more moments with you. Can you stay with us?
Yeah, you bet. Absolutely. All
right, stand by in just a moment. Glad to be sitting in. Ruben Navarrette is a columnist with the Washington Post Writers Group and at CNN.com. He's written an extraordinary piece, I believe, called Let's Have the Conversation About Race. So here we are on Labor Day with a new poll out from NBC News indicating that Americans believe that race relations in America are getting worse, not better. Ruben, in many ways, you were saying in your editorial piece at CNN.com, things that I would guess a lot of people think and feel and believe, but they're afraid to say. Have you gotten any kind of response to that effect, maybe from Anglo-America in particular? We recognize that there's this double standard, but my goodness, it's troublesome if we dare say it.
Right, absolutely. I think a lot of people did comment on that. I got, within a couple of hours, probably 3,000 comments on the CNN website, which is pretty fast and substantial.
Yes.
A reaction. And I think that the dominant thread there was, man, you took the words right out of my mouth. I've been thinking the same thing ever since the Chris Lane killing happened in Oklahoma. Every time I see a picture of the suspects or the people who've been arrested, they're African American. Some of them look African American. That was another thing that was complicated. If I may say, you have three suspects here, and not all of them were African American. And one seemed to have been of mixed background. Chancey Luna, who is Latino African American, it sounds like. And you have so it gets complicated. This is where we are in America, right? We don't send these little boxes that come from the Census Bureau.
Sure.
And so the story was much more, I think, nuanced than any of us were prepared for at the beginning. But yeah, the response has been pretty much, you took the words out of my mouth, and good for you, and that's a brave piece. And I will tell you that when this first came to me, I talked to my editor about it. I said, you know what? It takes a special editor to come to me and ask me to do this, because I can tell you not all my editors would ask me to do this, or an editor asked me, what did you think about Oklahoma? And I gave my response, and he said, write that up. It'd be a great piece. And I said, I'll do it if you stand by me. And he has. And
good. Well, it was extraordinarily candid. Listen, at the end of the day, I get what you're saying about these old black versus white sort of narratives, if you will, that
Right.
dominant forces in our national media are beholden to. But why necessarily the President of the United States or elected members of Congress or public officials who could make a difference, who have a bully pulpit, who could make a difference in the national conversation? I mean, we won't hear President Obama make any remarks about his friend, the baseballer, that look like Christopher Lane. Why not?
You know what's interesting? The other day I saw Cornel West refer to Al Sharpton as the, quote, house Negro of the Obama plantation. And, that didn't just come out of left field. There's a concern on the far left that President Obama has not done enough for African Americans, and people like Al Sharpton are covering for him. So you have that sense. You also have a sense from white Americans that he is too partial to African Americans and not there for them as white Americans. So he's getting it from all sides, and I hate criticism of the president all the time for various reasons. But I do think that we have these expectations of the first black president, and he's not met them for anybody. And so I think that there's a concern out there that the president, as you said, should rise to another level, represent all Americans, empathize with all Americans. That may be asking too much of any human being. Obviously when he sits and watches these movies that are very powerful, like I mentioned, The Butler. You watch The Freedom Rides. You watch the idea of an African-American butler in the White House. He's the president and the White House. It's going to speak to him in a different way. He obviously identifies with African-Americans more than he does with that part of his family that was white. So, what do you do with that? It's the human condition. It's where he's arrived. But as I said, he disappoints everybody in this regard, and I think it would be way too simplistic to think that somehow he's only angering African Americans or angering only whites. There's a lot of African Americans out there as well who think he hasn't been there for them.
Yep. Final question for you, Ruben Navarrette.
Yep.
Do you recommend to Anglo-Americans, white guys like me, that we are more candid in our observation of this double standard in the media and speak out about the double standard, or is it best to just kind of keep that to ourselves?
No, you should speak out about it, but you should also do it in a holistic way and not in a Pollyannish way where you end up doing the same thing that African Americans and Latinos have done for generations, which is you got to be the victim for the last 50 years. Now it's my turn. I want to be the victim.
Yep.
And I think oftentimes that's an American way of looking at things, and all of us fall prey to it. But we should be more nuanced and complicated in our views.
I like it. He's Ruben Navarrette. He is with the Washington Post Writers Group and CNN.com as well. He's based on the West Coast, but you can read him all over the country. Find him at RubenNavarrete.com. And also, I have tweeted his latest editorial from CNN.com on my Twitter account, at AskAustin. We're linking to his Twitter account, and we've got it at WMAL News as well. Ruben, as always, it's a pleasure, and have a great Labor Day.